During World War II, several thousands of women were forced into sexual slavery, known as comfort women, by the Imperial Japanese Army in comfort stations throughout Asia. This term, comfort women, is a translation of the Japanese euphemism ianfu, which means comforting, consoling women. Welcome back to the Before Now channel. In today's episode, we'll be diving into the forced enslavement of Asian women by the Japanese Imperial Army. We'll examine how these atrocities have been denied or minimized over time. Before we advance into this important topic, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Before Now channel, and comment below with your thoughts on how we can honor the voices of those who suffered. Your engagement helps us bring these stories to light. Now, let's get to it. Between 1931 and 1945, estimates suggest that 20,000 to 500,000 women and girls between the ages of 11 and 20 from various countries including China, Taiwan, Borneo, the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, Indonesia, Guam, Japan, Malaysia, and Korea were coerced into this sexual slavery. However, the majority of the women from Korea were often viewed as inferior by their captors. This systemic dehumanization highlights the racial dynamics at play during this horrific period. The Japanese government allegedly lured many of these women from their home countries, seducing them with the promise of respectable jobs and decent wages, with some even being kidnapped. Once inside these so-called comfort stations, women faced unimaginable abuse and exploitation, with their dignities stripped away as they became mere tools for soldiers' gratification. Being subjected to repeated sexual assaults, some of these women were forced to have sexual interactions with up to 40 men a day. The conditions were brutal. Many suffered psychological trauma that lasted long after the war ended. The comfort women system was not just an isolated incident. It was part of a broader strategy employed by the Japanese Imperial Army during their expansion across Asia. Contrary to claims that these stations would reduce random assaults on local populations and prevent sexually transmitted diseases among troops, they instead perpetuated a cycle of violence and disease. Clearly, the reality was grim. Many of these women were multiple times a day and subjected to horrific physical abuse if they resisted or attempted to escape. Furthermore, given the prostitution in Japan was pervasive and organized, it was logical to find military prostitution in the Japanese armed forces, with various justifications surrounding this practice. First, the system claimed to prevent soldiers from uncontrollably local women. However, because soldiers were able to inhabit these comfort stations, theoretically, only a select group of women would be assaulted, the comfort women. Next, the comfort system claimed to control the spread of venereal disease. As a result, not only were condoms made available, but the comfort women were frequently given shots for their diseases and were also often inspected by Japanese doctors so that any disease would be contained within these comfort stations. Another justification for the comfort system was that the soldiers' access to comfort women raised the army's morale and provided recreation for soldiers as a reward for fulfilling their patriotic duties. It was believed that sexually satisfied men were better soldiers and were generally mentally and physically healthier. National security was also argued as a justification for the creation of these stations. The suspicious Japanese government realized that spies lurked in private brothels and therefore instituted its own camouflage brothel to safeguard military information. Tight security ensured that non-military and paramilitary men could not gain unauthorized entry. Also, the Japanese government was able to raise revenue from taxing the stations, as there were numerous stations throughout Asia. Eventually, as World War II ended, so did the comfort system, but fewer than 30% of the comfort women survived. Many were unable to endure the horrible conditions in which they lived, while others were murdered, abandoned in unknown cities with no way home, or forced to end their own lives. Some comfort women were even married off to Japanese soldiers after the war. Those who did survive often suffered from sterility due to inadequate medical treatment and incessant sexual abuse in the comfort stations. Those who did persevere continue to suffer to this day, plagued with severe physical and emotional problems, including infertility, sexually transmitted diseases, insomnia, nervous breakdowns, psychological trauma, and shame. Upon return to their home countries, many ended their own lives due to the shame they felt and the ostracism that resulted from their families and communities. Survivors like Kim Hak-soon bravely stepped forward in the early 1990s to share their stories, breaking decades of silence surrounding these atrocities. Their testimonies revealed not only personal trauma, but also systemic injustice, a struggle for recognition that has persisted for over 70 years. But why was this atrocity largely unacknowledged? In 1990, more than 36 women's groups in South Korea joined forces to establish the Korean Council for the Women Drafted for Military Sexual Slavery by Japan. After initial Japanese denial of responsibility, the council called for an admission of culpability, an apology, a memorial, and financial compensation for victims, and demanded that Japanese textbooks be altered to reflect the realities of sexual slavery. The Japanese government proceeded to deny evidence of coercing comfort women and rejected calls for compensation, stating that the 1965 treaty between Japan and South Korea had settled all outstanding matters. Additionally, the issue of comfort women gained international awareness in 1991, when a group of surviving women breaking decades of silence filed a class action lawsuit against the Japanese government. These women and their supporters sued for compensation on the grounds of human rights violations. Around the same time, Yoshimi Yoshiaki, a historian from Cho University in Tokyo, discovered documents in the archives of Japan's self-defense force and published a report of his findings that directly linked the Japanese wartime military and government to the maintenance of the comfort women system. As a result, in 1991, the Japanese government publicly admitted for the first time that comfort stations had existed during the war. 2 years later, in a statement issued by the chief cabinet minister, the government also acknowledged its involvement in the recruitment of comfort women and its deception of those women, and it apologized for affronting their honor. Although the Japanese government denied any legal responsibility for the sexual assaults, it set up the Asian Women's Fund in 1995 as an attempt at resolution. However, the fund was sustained by donations from private citizens, not government money, and Korean activists opposed its existence. Ultimately, the fund ceased to operate in 2007. The comfort women issue remained highly sensitive in Japan. While the existence of the wartime program had become general knowledge, many Japanese, particularly right-wing nationalists, continued to refute it, specifically disputing whether the women had been forced to work in the comfort stations. In 2007, Abe Shinzo, during his first term as prime minister, stated there was no evidence of coercion, though he later retracted this comment. The topic resurfaced publicly in 2014 during Abe's second term. A Japanese newspaper reported that it had retracted stories from the 1980s and 90s about women being coerced after a Japanese man who had previously claimed responsibility later denied his involvement. That same year, Abe's government also petitioned the United Nations to request a revision of its 1996 report, but UN officials quickly denied the request. Despite this acknowledgement from the Japanese government and attempts at reparations, many survivors felt these measures fell short. The lack of a formal apology and legal accountability has left wounds unhealed. Ongoing lawsuits in South Korea highlight the struggle for justice, as survivors and their families continue to fight against state immunity claims that shield perpetrators from accountability. As we reflect on this painful history, it's important to remember that these women are not just statistics. They are individuals with stories that deserve to be told. What can we do today to ensure that their suffering is not forgotten? The legacy of comfort women is one of resilience against oppression. By sharing their stories, we honor their struggle and contribute to a broader understanding of human rights abuses throughout history. Thank you for joining us in this exploration of one of history's darkest chapters. Remember to like this video if you found it informative. Subscribe for more content on historical events that shaped our world, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Together, let's honor those who suffered by keeping their stories alive.